The musty smell of mothballs filled Eleanor Whitfield's nostrils as she climbed the creaking stairs to her attic. At 78, each step was deliberate, her arthritic hands gripping the worn banister. The charity sale had seemed simple when she'd mentioned it to Catherine last Sunday after church. Clean out the attic, donate what they no longer needed, raise money for the church roof fund. Dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight streaming through the small window, casting shadows across boxes undisturbed for years. Henry had always handled the attic, claiming he knew where everything was stored. "Don't worry about that old junk up there, Ellie," he'd say with that charming smile. "I'll handle all that business stuff." She'd trusted him completely, the way wives in Millfield trusted their husbands. Her weathered hands trembled as she reached for a dust-covered trunk beneath the eaves, its brass corners green with age. The lock had rusted away, leaving only the ghost of security. Henry had passed 3 years ago, and Eleanor had avoided this space until now. It felt like disturbing his memory. The trunk opened with a groan. Inside, beneath crumbling tissue paper, lay photographs, documents, and papers that made no sense. Birth certificates bearing the Whitfield name, but for children she'd never heard of. Marriage certificates with Henry's signature, but not her name beside his. Letters from women she didn't recognize, speaking of love and promises that excluded her completely. Eleanor sank onto an old crate, her heart hammering as she examined each document. The dates spanned decades, some predating their marriage, others continuing through their supposedly happy union. Names like Sarah Whitfield, born 1963, Thomas Whitfield, born 1970. Children who shared her husband's name but not her memory. The afternoon light shifted, and Eleanor realized she'd been sitting for hours, surrounded by evidence of a parallel life. Her legs had grown stiff, but her mind raced with multiplying questions. The Henry she'd buried 3 years ago, who'd built their ranch house with his own hands, who'd never missed church, suddenly felt like a stranger. Her fingers brushed something else in the corner. A leather journal in Margaret's precise handwriting. Margaret, Henry's sister who'd lived with them her final decade, and passed away 15 years earlier. Eleanor opened the journal. The family meeting tonight was particularly tense. Henry insists we must continue protecting Eleanor from the truth. The burden of keeping these secrets grows heavier each year, but we've come too far to turn back now. She trusts us completely, and perhaps that trust is the only gift we can still give her. Betrayal settled into Eleanor's chest like a stone. She closed the journal and sat in gathering dusk, surrounded by the wreckage of what she'd believed was her life. Outside, Millfield's familiar evening sounds continued. Children called home for dinner, the freight train's distant whistle, the ordinary rhythm of a small Ohio town. Everything she'd known about her marriage, family, and place in this community suddenly felt fragile as tissue paper. Eleanor had always prided herself on her intuition, her ability to read people. Yet she'd spent 53 years married to a man whose true nature remained hidden. The first birth certificate lay open on her lap, dated June 15, 1963. Sarah Whitfield, born in Riverside, Ohio, 40 miles away. Father, Henry Whitfield. Mother, Rose Martinez. Eleanor calculated quickly. She and Henry had married in 1961. Catherine wasn't born until 1965. The implications crashed over her like sudden storms across Ohio's farmland. Eleanor carefully replaced the documents and closed the trunk. Alice Cooper's apple pie scented the evening air next door, and she realized Alice would be expecting their usual Tuesday coffee. Alice, her closest friend for 40 years, who'd consoled her through Henry's illness. Standing slowly, Eleanor felt 78 years settling into her bones. But alongside physical weariness came determination that surprised her with its intensity. She'd spent most of her life accepting what others told her, trusting in love's reliability. Now, faced with evidence challenging everything she'd believed, Eleanor made a decision that would change not only her remaining years, but everyone connected to the Whitfield name. Tomorrow she would begin asking questions that should have been asked decades ago. Tonight she would sit with Alice and drink coffee and pretend the world still made sense, because she needed one more evening of the life she'd known before everything changed forever. Catherine's voice carried that particular edge Eleanor recognized, the tone her daughter used when managing crises. "Mom, you sound strange. Are you feeling all right? Did you remember your blood pressure medication?" Eleanor shifted the phone, glancing at the kitchen table where birth certificates lay spread like accusations. She'd spent a sleepless night weighing her words, deciding how to approach the conversation that would shatter her family's careful peace. "Catherine, I need to ask you about something I found yesterday. Could you come over this morning?" The pause stretched long enough for Eleanor to hear Catherine's household morning routine, her son-in-law preparing for work, grandchildren arguing over cereal, coffee brewing. Normal sounds of a normal family beginning a normal day. Unaware Eleanor was about to introduce chaos. "Mom, I'm supposed to drive to Columbus today for Sarah's college orientation, remember? Can't this wait until tomorrow?" Eleanor looked at the certificate bearing the name Sarah Whitfield, born to Rose Martinez in 1963. The name coincidence felt cosmic. "No, Catherine. This cannot wait. This has waited far too long." Something in Eleanor's tone penetrated Catherine's morning rush. "Mom, you're scaring me. What's wrong? Did something happen with the house? Your health? Your father?" Eleanor said simply, then stopped. How did one begin a conversation that would destroy a daughter's memory of her beloved father? How did one explain that the man who taught Catherine to ride a bicycle, walked her down the aisle at St. Matthew's Episcopal, held his grandchildren with obvious joy, had been living multiple lives for decades? What about Dad? "Mom, he's been gone 3 years. What could possibly be urgent about something involving Dad?" Eleanor closed her eyes and made the decision that would end her family's peaceful ignorance forever. "I found documents in the attic yesterday, Catherine. Birth certificates for children with your father's name. Children born while he was married to me. Children I never knew existed." The silence stretched across not just the phone line, but across years of family dinners and Christmas mornings, and shared memories that suddenly felt contaminated by deception. Eleanor could almost hear Catherine's mind working, processing, rejecting, accepting, finally settling into a defensive posture years in the making. "Mom, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Dad was involved in community work. Maybe he sponsored families or helped with adoptions. You know how he was always helping people." The explanation came too quickly, too smoothly, with practiced ease of someone who'd spent years preparing for this exact conversation. Eleanor's stomach dropped as she realized Catherine's surprise wasn't about the documents' existence. It was about Eleanor's discovery of them. "Catherine Elizabeth Whitfield Davis, you knew." Another pause, heavy with admission's weight. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had lost its artificial brightness and settled into the tired tone of someone carrying a burden they'd hoped never to share. "Mom, please, can we not do this over the phone? Can you please just put whatever you found back where you found it and let sleeping dogs lie? Dad is gone. Whatever happened in the past doesn't matter anymore. Why do you want to hurt yourself this way?" Eleanor stood so quickly her chair scraped linoleum with a sound like fingernails on glass. "Hurt myself? Catherine, how long have you known about this? How long has my own daughter been lying to me about my own marriage?" "It wasn't lying, Mom. It was protecting you. Dad made us promise, before he died, that you would never have to know about his mistakes. He said you deserved to remember him as the man who loved you, not as the man who let you down." The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Not only had Henry deceived her for decades, but her own children had conspired to continue that deception after his death. The kitchen that had always been her sanctuary suddenly felt like foreign territory. Us? Who else knows, Catherine? "Mom, please don't make me do this. Please don't make me be the one who destroys our family." But Eleanor was past the point where maternal consideration could override her need for truth. "Who else knows about your father's other families? Daniel knows. Uncle Robert knew before he passed. Aunt Margaret knew. Even Alice Cooper knows, Mom. Dad asked her to keep an eye on you after he was gone, to make sure you were okay when the truth eventually came out." The betrayal was complete now, extending beyond Henry and Catherine to encompass her son, deceased brother-in-law, late sister-in-law, and even Alice, who had sat in this very kitchen last night, discussing the church bazaar, while knowing Eleanor's entire life was built on carefully maintained lies. Eleanor sank back into her chair, feeling suddenly ancient and foolish. She had prided herself on reading people, understanding family dynamics and community relationships, yet everyone around her had been performing an elaborate charade for her benefit, treating her like a child needing protection from adult reality's complexities. "How many other families, Catherine?" "Mom, I really think we should talk about this in person. I'm going to cancel the Columbus trip and come over right now." "How many?" Defeat was audible in Catherine's voice. "3 that we know of. Maybe more. Dad wasn't always forthcoming about his business trips, even with us." Eleanor looked out her kitchen window toward the Cooper house, where Alice was probably beginning her morning routine of watering prize-winning flower beds. Alice, who had comforted her through Henry's final illness, helped plan his funeral, been her constant companion through grief and widowhood's adjustment. "I want you to come over, Catherine, but bring Daniel with you, and call Alice and ask her to come as well. It's time for this family to stop protecting me from my own life." Margaret's journal proved to be a roadmap through decades of family deception, each entry revealing another layer of conspiracy that had shaped Eleanor's adult life. As Catherine and Daniel sat uncomfortably on the living room sofa, avoiding their mother's eyes, Eleanor read aloud from pages documenting family meetings she'd never been invited to attend. December 15th, 1978. Another Christmas approaches, and Henry is becoming increasingly nervous about maintaining different stories for different families. He's asked Catherine, now 13, to help keep track of which gifts go to which households. "I worry about the burden we're placing on these children, but Henry insists Eleanor's happiness depends on her never knowing the truth." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his large frame seeming too big for delicate furniture that had belonged to Eleanor's mother. At 45, he had inherited Henry's broad shoulders and easy smile, but today that smile was nowhere to be found. "Mom, you have to understand. We were just kids when this started. Dad made it seem like we were protecting you, like telling you would hurt you more than keeping quiet." Eleanor looked up from the journal to study her younger child. This man who had brought his own children to Sunday dinner just last week kissed her cheek and told her how much he appreciated everything she'd done for the family. "How old were you when you found out, Daniel?" 12. Dad took me with him on one of his business trips to Riverside. We stopped at a house and there was a boy there who looked exactly like me, maybe a year older. Dad introduced him as my half-brother Tommy and said I needed to understand that some things in life were complicated. Catherine reached over and touched Daniel's arm, a gesture clearly indicating this wasn't their first discussion of their father's revelations. "Dad said that you had been through enough in your life, Mom. Your parents died when you were so young. You'd worked so hard to help put him through school. You deserved the happiness of believing you were his only wife." Eleanor thought about those early marriage years, when she'd taken extra shifts at Morrison's Five and Dime to help pay for Henry's accounting courses, when they'd lived in a cramped apartment above the hardware store, and dreamed of the house they'd eventually build on Maple Street. She'd been proud of their partnership, proud of the sacrifices they'd made together to build a stable life in Millfield. "And how did your father explain supporting multiple households on his accountant's salary?" Catherine cleared her throat nervously. "He said he was helping families in crisis, that the Martinez family in Riverside had been clients who fell on hard times, and he was helping with the children's expenses. That Mrs. Johnson in Centerville was a widow who needed assistance. We thought he was being charitable. Until you got older and realized the truth. Until I started working at Dad's office during summer breaks in high school, Daniel admitted. I saw the checks he was writing, the separate checking accounts, the way he scheduled his trips. It wasn't charity, Mom. It was him maintaining 3 separate lives. Eleanor returned to Margaret's journal, flipping through pages documenting Christmas gifts purchased in triplicate, school events attended in different towns, and increasingly elaborate lies required to maintain Henry's deception. Margaret's handwriting grew shakier in later entries, reflecting either advancing age or growing discomfort with her enabling role. June 3rd, 1995. Eleanor mentioned today that she wished Henry didn't have to travel so much for business. She said she missed him and wondered if they might take a vacation together to Florida, like the Millers did last year. Henry asked me to discourage her from this idea. I am becoming increasingly uncomfortable with my role in maintaining these deceptions, but the alternative, watching Eleanor's world collapse, seems equally unacceptable. The front door opened without a knock, and Alice Cooper entered carrying a covered dish that smelled like her famous cornbread. Alice's routine visits had been such a constant that she rarely bothered knocking anymore. Today, however, her usual cheerful greeting died as she took in the scene. Eleanor with the journal, Catherine and Daniel looking like children caught in mischief, documents spread across the coffee table. "Oh," Alice said softly, setting down the cornbread with unsteady hands. "I guess the time for secrets is over." Eleanor studied her oldest friend, this woman who had been her maid of honor, helped deliver both her children when snowstorms made. Reaching the hospital impossible, held her hand during Henry's funeral service. "How long have you known, Alice?" Alice removed her coat slowly, buying time before settling into the armchair that had become designated as hers during their decades of friendship. "Henry told me about Rose Martinez before he married you, Eleanor. He said he'd made mistakes when he was young, but that he loved you and wanted to start fresh. I thought the Riverside situation was in his past, but it wasn't. No, it wasn't." Alice's voice was barely above a whisper. "When Catherine was born, Henry came to me and asked if I thought he should tell you about Sarah. I told him that a man's past mistakes shouldn't destroy his wife's happiness. I advised him to let sleeping dogs lie." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized the conspiracy's full scope. And when the other families came along, Alice's eyes filled with tears she made no attempt to hide. By then, it felt too late to change course. Henry was providing for all these women and children, and you were so happy, Eleanor. You glowed with happiness. Your marriage seemed perfect to everyone in town. The alternative was destroying not just your happiness, but the lives of all those other families who depended on him. The room fell silent except for the grandfather clock's ticking, the same clock that had belonged to Eleanor's parents and measured the minutes and hours of her life for over 50 years. Each tick now seemed to mark another moment of deception, another second of the lie she'd been living. Catherine broke the silence. "Mom, what are you going to do with this information? Dad is gone. Those other families have moved on with their lives. What good can come from digging up the past now?" Eleanor closed Margaret's journal and looked around the room at faces of people she'd trusted completely. Her children, her best friend, the sister-in-law who had seemed like a second mother. All had conspired to keep her ignorant of her own life, all in the name of protecting her happiness. "I'm going to find these other families," Eleanor said with clarity that surprised even her. "I'm going to meet the women who shared my husband and the children who share his name. I'm going to find out exactly what kind of life I've been living and what kind of man I was married to." The horror on her family's faces told Eleanor everything she needed to know about how difficult that journey would be. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt truly alive. The address from the birth certificate led Eleanor down a winding country road toward Riverside, past cornfields stretching toward the horizon like a green ocean. Catherine had refused to accompany her, and Daniel was too busy with work commitments, leaving Eleanor to drive herself 40 miles in her elderly Buick, with only the radio for company. The house at 247 Oakwood Drive was smaller than expected, a modest ranch similar to her own but with peeling paint and a yard speaking of ongoing financial struggles. Children's toys scattered across the front porch suggested multiple generations shared the space, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she parked and walked toward the front door. Rose Martinez answered the bell with flour on her hands, and surprise on her face that quickly shifted to something more complex when Eleanor introduced herself. Rose was shorter than Eleanor, with graying dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and lines around her eyes, speaking of years of worry and hard work. She appeared roughly Eleanor's age, perhaps a few years younger, and carried herself with efficient movements of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rose said carefully, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "I've been wondering when this day would come." They sat at Rose's kitchen table, covered with cheerful oilcloth, showing signs of decades of family meals. The coffee Rose served was strong and black, accompanied by homemade cookies that reminded Eleanor of ones her own mother used to make. Through the kitchen window, Eleanor could see a vegetable garden that put her own modest efforts to shame. "I found Sarah's birth certificate among Henry's papers," Eleanor began, unsure of protocol for such conversations. "I'm sorry to intrude on your life like this, but I need to understand what happened." Rose studied Eleanor's face with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to be measuring her carefully. "What did Henry tell you about his business trips? That he was helping local businesses with their accounting, consulting work that required him to travel several days each month." Eleanor's voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "And you never questioned that?" The directness stung, but Eleanor recognized she deserved whatever judgments Rose might have about her willingness to accept Henry's explanations. "No, I trusted him completely. In Millfield, that's what wives do." Rose nodded with understanding that seemed to carry its own burden of experience. "Henry came to me in 1962, when I was working at the diner in town. I was 19, and my husband had been killed in a factory accident 6 months earlier. I was pregnant and had no family to help me. Henry offered to take care of everything." Take care of everything? Housing, medical bills, support for the baby. In exchange, I would be his wife in all but legal terms when he visited Riverside. He said his business required him to maintain a presence in different communities, and I would be his local connection. Eleanor tried to process this information while Rose continued. "I knew he was married, Mrs. Whitfield. He never lied to me about that, but I was desperate, and he offered me a way to keep my baby and maintain some dignity. The alternative was giving Sarah up for adoption or ending up on the street." "And you agreed to this arrangement?" "I agreed to survival," Rose said simply. "When you're 19 and pregnant and alone, dignity becomes a luxury you can't afford." The kitchen door opened, and a man in his early 30s entered, carrying a toddler, and followed by a woman about the same age. The man's resemblance to Henry was unmistakable. The same strong jaw, deep-set eyes, way of holding his shoulders. Eleanor felt her breath catch as she realized she was looking at her husband's son. "Mom, Mrs. Cooper called and said there was a car with Millfield plates in the driveway," the man said, then stopped as he noticed Eleanor. His expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, recognition, and something that might have been sympathy. "Tommy," Rose said. "This is Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, Henry's widow." Tommy Martinez set down the toddler and extended his hand with formality, suggesting he'd been preparing for this meeting his entire life. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm sorry for your loss. Dad spoke of you often." The word "dad" hit Eleanor like a physical blow. This man, this stranger, who carried Henry's features and mannerisms, had a relationship with her husband that spanned decades. While Eleanor had been celebrating birthdays and anniversaries in Millfield, Tommy had been sharing different milestones with the same man in Riverside. He spoke of me. Tommy exchanged a glance with his mother before answering. He said you were the love of his life, Mrs. Whitfield. He said you represented everything, good and pure, that he'd lost track of in his younger years. He said protecting your happiness was the most important thing he'd ever done. Eleanor felt tears threatening for the first time since discovering the documents. Not tears of sadness, but tears of rage at the presumption that her happiness required such elaborate deception, that her worth as a human being was so fragile it couldn't withstand the truth about her own marriage. And what about your happiness, Tommy? What about Sarah's happiness? What about your mother's happiness? Rose answered before her son could respond. We knew what we were getting into, Mrs. Whitfield. Henry was honest with us about the limitations of our situation. We made our choices with full knowledge of what they meant. But I made my choices without any knowledge at all. The silence was broken by the toddler, who had wandered over to Eleanor and was now tugging on her skirt with fearless childhood curiosity. Eleanor looked down into a face that carried unmistakable traces of Henry's features mixed with younger generations, and she realized she was looking at her husband's grandchild. This is Maria, Tommy said quietly. She's 3. Eleanor knelt to the child's level, studying the small face that represented the continuation of deceptions that had shaped 3 generations. Maria smiled and offered Eleanor a cookie from her small fist, a gesture of pure innocence in the midst of decades of complicated adult choices. Maria, Eleanor repeated, tasting the name of a granddaughter she'd never known existed. She's beautiful. Rose's voice was gentle when she spoke again. Mrs. Whitfield, what are you hoping to accomplish by coming here? Henry has been gone for 3 years. Our lives have moved on. What happened in the past can't be changed. Eleanor stood slowly, her knees protesting the movement, and looked around Rose's kitchen, at family photographs on the refrigerator, children's artwork taped to walls, evidence of a life built around Henry's visits and support. This was a real family, with real relationships and real love, even if it had been built on a foundation that excluded Eleanor's knowledge or consent. I don't know what I'm hoping to accomplish, Eleanor admitted, but I spent 53 years living a lie, and I need to understand the shape and size of that lie before I can figure out what's left of my own life. Rose nodded with understanding that came from years of living with difficult truths. There are others, Mrs. Whitfield. Other families. If you're determined to follow this path, you should know that our situation was not unique. Eleanor had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still felt like another blow. How many others? At least 2 that I know of. Possibly more. Henry was a man who believed he could solve problems by creating separate solutions for each one. He never considered that the problems might eventually find each other. As Eleanor drove back toward Millfield, the setting sun painted the cornfields golden and cast long shadows across the road. In her purse, she carried Rose Martinez's phone number and the names of 2 other towns where Henry had maintained his separate lives. The woman she'd been that morning, the widow who believed she understood her own history, no longer existed. The drive to Centerville took Eleanor through Columbus, past shopping centers and subdivisions that had sprouted during decades when she'd rarely ventured far from Millfield. Barbara Johnson's neighborhood was newer than Rose Martinez's, with well-maintained lawns and driveways filled with late-model cars, suggesting a more prosperous lifestyle. The woman who answered the door at 1247 Elm Street was tall and elegant, with silver hair styled in a way that spoke of regular salon visits and clothing, suggesting comfortable middle-class life. Barbara Johnson was probably a few years younger than Eleanor, and she carried herself with confidence of someone accustomed to managing complex situations with grace and efficiency. Mrs. Whitfield, Barbara said, as though she'd been expecting this visit for years. Please come in. I have coffee ready." Barbara's living room was decorated with family photographs dominating every available surface. Children at various ages, graduation photos, wedding pictures, and images of grandchildren who clearly brought joy to their grandmother's life. Eleanor noticed immediately that Henry appeared in many of these photographs, sometimes standing beside Barbara at family gatherings, sometimes holding children who shared his features. "How did you know I would come?" Eleanor asked as Barbara poured coffee from a silver service that Eleanor recognized as similar to one Henry had given her for their 20th anniversary. "Rose Martinez called yesterday. She said you'd visited her and that you were asking questions about Henry's other families. I've been preparing for this conversation for 3 years, ever since Henry passed." Eleanor studied the photographs more carefully, noticing dates corresponding to important events in her own marriage. A Christmas picture from 1985 showed Henry standing beside Barbara and 3 children around a tree, decorated almost identically to the one Eleanor remembered from that same year. A graduation photo from 1992 featured Henry beaming proudly beside a young man who could have been Daniel's twin. "Barbara, how did your arrangement with Henry begin?" Barbara settled into an armchair, clearly her favorite spot in the room, positioned to look out the front window toward a garden that rivaled anything Eleanor had seen in Millfield's better neighborhoods. "I was 25 when my first husband left. He just disappeared one day, leaving me with 3 small children and debts I couldn't pay. I was working as a secretary at the accounting firm where Henry was a client. And he offered to help? He offered to solve my problems completely. Housing, child support, educational expenses for the children. In exchange, I would be his wife and partner when he was in Centerville, and I would never ask questions about his life in other places." Eleanor tried to imagine herself at 25, faced with 3 small children and overwhelming financial responsibilities, being offered such an arrangement by a married man. The judgment she'd initially felt toward these women was being replaced by a more complex understanding of the impossible choices they'd faced. "Did you ever consider that what he was offering was wrong?" Barbara's laugh was gentle but tinged with irony. "Mrs. Whitfield, when you're facing eviction and your children are asking why there's no food in the refrigerator, moral abstractions become luxuries you can't afford. Henry offered us stability and security. More than that, he offered us love and partnership. Whatever his limitations, he was a good father to my children and a devoted partner to me." Eleanor looked again at the photographs, noticing the obvious affection in Henry's face as he interacted with Barbara's family. These weren't images of a man fulfilling obligations out of guilt or duty. They showed someone genuinely engaged with the children he was helping to raise. "Did the children know about me?" "They knew about you from the beginning, Mrs. Whitfield. Henry was always honest with them about the fact that he had a wife in Millfield whom he loved very much. He explained that adult relationships could be complicated, and that loving one family didn't mean he couldn't also love another family." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest at the realization that Barbara's children had been raised with more honesty about Henry's life than her own children had received. While Catherine and Daniel had been protecting her from the truth, other children had been learning to accept the complexity of sharing a father with multiple families. The front door opened, and a woman in her 40s entered carrying grocery bags and calling out a greeting to her mother. The woman stopped when she saw Eleanor, and her expression shifted through the same sequence of emotions Eleanor had witnessed in Tommy Martinez: surprise, recognition, and careful evaluation. "Mom, is this..." "Rebecca, this is Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield." "Eleanor, this is my daughter, Rebecca, Henry's daughter." Rebecca set down her groceries and approached Eleanor with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Whitfield, I've wanted to meet you for years. Dad talked about you constantly. He said you were the most wonderful woman he'd ever known." Eleanor found herself studying Rebecca's face, noting Henry's eyes and his way of tilting his head when thinking. This was another of Henry's children. Another person who had shared her husband's love and attention for decades, while remaining completely unknown to Eleanor. Rebecca, what did your father tell you about his life in Millfield? He said he had a wife who made him want to be a better man than he actually was. He said you represented all the good choices he wished he'd made when he was younger, and that protecting your happiness was the most important responsibility he had in life. Eleanor felt tears threatening again, not from sadness but from frustration at Henry's persistent need to idealize her, while treating other women as capable of handling difficult truths. And you never resented sharing him with someone you'd never met. Rebecca exchanged a glance with her mother before answering. Mrs. Whitfield, Dad didn't divide his love among different families. He multiplied it. When he was with us, he was completely present. When he talked about you, it was clear that his love for you didn't diminish his love for us. If anything, it seemed to increase his capacity for love overall. Barbara stood and moved to a bookshelf where she withdrew a wooden box similar to the one Eleanor had found in her attic. Mrs. Whitfield, I think there are some things you should see. The box contained letters Henry had written to Barbara over the years, and Barbara handed Eleanor several marked with dates corresponding to important events in Eleanor's own marriage. The first letter was dated shortly after Catherine's birth in 1965. My dearest Barbara, Eleanor read aloud. Eleanor gave birth to our daughter Catherine yesterday, and I am overwhelmed with joy and terror. Joy at this perfect little person we've created, and terror at the thought of how my divided life might affect her future. I find myself praying that I can be the father she deserves while honoring my commitments to you and the children. Sometimes I wonder if I'm creating more problems than I'm solving, but then I look at your beautiful family, and I know that I can't abandon the people who depend on me. Eleanor set down the letter and looked at Barbara, trying to process the emotional complexity of a man who could feel genuine joy about his daughter's birth, while simultaneously writing love letters to another woman. He was tortured by this situation, wasn't he? More than you can imagine, Barbara replied. But he was also committed to making it work for everyone involved. Henry wasn't a selfish man, Mrs. Whitfield. He was a man who believed he could solve every problem if he just worked hard enough and loved deeply enough. As Eleanor drove back toward Millfield in the early evening, she found herself thinking not about Henry's deceptions, but about the strength and dignity of the women who had shared him. Rose Martinez, raising children alone while building a stable home. Barbara Johnson, transforming herself from an abandoned wife into a confident woman who had raised successful children. These were not victims or homewreckers. They were women who had made difficult choices and built meaningful lives within the constraints Henry's complicated morality had created. Thomas Bradley's law office occupied the second floor of the old First National Bank building on Millfield's Main Street, in rooms that still carried the faint aroma of leather and pipe tobacco from decades when the town's legal business had been conducted by Thomas's father and grandfather. Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs slowly, her hand gripping the worn wooden banister as she tried to organize questions that had kept her awake for the past week. Thomas had been Henry's closest friend since high school, the best man at their wedding, and the executor of Henry's will. He'd guided Eleanor through the probate process with patient kindness, handling paperwork and legal details that had seemed overwhelming in her grief. Now, sitting across from him in the same chair where she'd signed documents 3 years ago, Eleanor saw her old friend differently. Ellie, Thomas said, using the nickname only Henry and her oldest friends were permitted. Catherine called and told me you've been asking questions about Henry's papers. I was hoping we could avoid this conversation. Eleanor placed Rose Martinez's phone number on Thomas's desk, along with photocopies of the birth certificates she'd found in the attic. Were you Henry's lawyer for his other families too, Thomas? The older man removed his glasses and cleaned them with movements that seemed designed to buy time rather than improve his vision. Thomas Bradley had always been careful with his words, a trait that had served him well in small-town law practice, but now felt like another form of protection Eleanor didn't want or need. Eleanor, there are confidentiality issues here that complicate what I can tell you. Attorney-client privilege doesn't end when a client passes away. But your friendship with me should be more important than legal technicalities, shouldn't it? Thomas replaced his glasses and looked directly at Eleanor for the first time since she'd entered his office. Henry made me promise, before he died, that I would help you maintain your life in Millfield without the burden of knowing about his other obligations. He was very specific about wanting to protect you from information that could only cause you pain. Eleanor leaned forward in her chair, fixing Thomas with a stare she'd perfected during decades of dealing with evasive children and neighbors who tried to avoid responsibility for their actions. Thomas Bradley, I am 78 years old. I have survived the deaths of my parents, the challenges of raising 2 children during difficult economic times, and the loss of my husband. I think I can handle the truth about my own marriage. Ellie, please. Henry loved you more than anything in this world. His other arrangements were complicated, but they didn't diminish what he felt for you. His other arrangements. Is that what we're calling bigamy now? Thomas winced at the word, and Eleanor realized she'd struck closer to the legal reality than anyone in her family had been willing to acknowledge. It wasn't bigamy in the legal sense. Henry only married you legally, Eleanor. The other relationships were informal arrangements. Informal arrangements that lasted for decades and produced children and grandchildren I never knew existed. Eleanor's voice was rising despite her efforts to maintain composure. Informal arrangements that apparently everyone in this town knew about except me. Not everyone knew, Eleanor. And those who did know understood that Henry was trying to take care of people who needed help. Rose Martinez was a young widow with a baby. Barbara Johnson was struggling to raise 3 children after her husband left. Virginia Adams was caring for her elderly mother and couldn't work full-time. Henry saw himself as providing solutions for impossible situations. Eleanor absorbed this information, adding Virginia Adams to her mental list of women who had shared her husband's attention and resources. And what about the solutions he provided for me, Thomas? What was my impossible situation that required Henry's management? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a secret he'd obviously carried for decades. Henry believed that you were too good for the compromises he'd made in his life. He said you deserved to believe in perfect love and perfect marriage, and that knowing about his other obligations would destroy something pure and beautiful in you. The paternalistic assumptions underlying Henry's decisions hit Eleanor like a slap. Her husband had spent their entire marriage treating her like a child who needed protection from reality, like a delicate flower who couldn't survive in the same world where other women raised children alone and managed complex family situations with strength and dignity. So Henry decided that Rose and Barbara and Virginia were strong enough to handle the truth about sharing a husband. But I was too fragile to manage that knowledge. Eleanor, please don't make this about what Henry thought of your strength. He was trying to give you the gift of an uncomplicated love. Eleanor stood and began pacing around Thomas's office, past the law books and family photographs and certificates that documented his professional life. The gift of an uncomplicated love? Thomas, my marriage was built on lies so elaborate that they required the participation of our entire community. How is that uncomplicated? Because you were happy, Ellie. For 53 years, you were genuinely happy. You had a husband who adored you, children who respected you, a community that valued you. Most people would consider that a successful life. Eleanor stopped pacing and turned to face Thomas directly. Most people would consider that a successful lie. What I want to know is whether there's any truth left to build on, or whether everything I believed about my life was fiction. Thomas opened a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder that Eleanor recognized as containing Henry's legal documents. If you're determined to pursue this, Eleanor, you should know that the situation is more complicated than just the other families. Henry maintained separate financial arrangements for each household, and some of those arrangements involved property and investments that could affect your own inheritance. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in Thomas's office. What kind of property and investments? Henry purchased homes for both Rose and Barbara. He established education funds for all the children. He maintained life insurance policies with different beneficiaries. When he died, I had to navigate some very complex legal territory to ensure that his estate was handled properly. Are you telling me that other women have claims on what I thought was my inheritance? Thomas nodded reluctantly. I managed to protect your primary assets. The house, Henry's pension, the majority of his investments. But yes, there are other claims on his estate that we resolved quietly to avoid complications. Eleanor sank back into her chair as the full scope of Henry's deception became clear. Not only had he maintained multiple families, but he'd made financial commitments that effectively reduced her own inheritance. The money she'd been living on for the past 3 years, the security she'd counted on for her remaining years, had been diminished by obligations to women and children she'd never known existed. I want to see all the documents, Thomas. I want to understand exactly what kind of financial arrangements Henry made and what obligations still exist. And I want the addresses for Barbara Johnson and Virginia Adams. Thomas looked as though he was about to protest, then seemed to recognize something in Eleanor's expression that discouraged argument. Eleanor, I can give you that information, but I want you to think carefully about what you're doing. These other women have built lives around the arrangements Henry made with them. Disrupting those arrangements now could cause a lot of pain for everyone involved. Eleanor thought about Rose Martinez and her son Tommy, about the grandchild she'd never known existed, about the decades of careful lies that had shaped multiple families' lives. Thomas, everyone's life was disrupted the day Henry decided to create these arrangements. I'm not disrupting anything. I'm just finally learning about disruptions that happened decades ago. Virginia Adams lived in Lancaster in a Victorian house that had been converted into apartments. Its once grand architecture now divided into smaller units, providing affordable housing for elderly residents and young families. Eleanor found Virginia's apartment on the 2nd floor, climbing stairs that creaked with age and wear. The hallway smelled of cooking spices and old wood, and she could hear televisions and conversations filtering through thin walls, separating dozens of individual lives. Virginia answered the door slowly, moving with careful deliberation of someone managing chronic pain or mobility issues. She was smaller than Eleanor had expected, probably in her early 70s, with gray hair that had been carefully permed and clothing that was clean but showed signs of long wear. Her apartment was tiny but immaculately maintained, with every surface displaying photographs, crafts, and mementos that spoke of a life lived with attention to beauty, despite limited resources. Mrs. Whitfield, Virginia said in a voice that was softer than either Rose's or Barbara's had been. I wondered if you'd find your way to me eventually. Please, sit down. I'll make tea. Eleanor settled into a chair positioned near a window overlooking Lancaster's main street, watching pedestrians and traffic move through a town that was larger than Millfield but still small enough that neighbors probably knew each other's business. Virginia's apartment felt like a sanctuary, carefully arranged to maximize comfort and peace within a very small space. Virginia, I've met Rose Martinez and Barbara Johnson. They both mentioned that your situation with Henry was different from theirs. Virginia returned from the kitchen carrying a tea service that was obviously one of her treasured possessions, with delicate china cups and a matching pot that had probably been a wedding gift decades earlier. Different, yes. I was never Henry's wife in any sense, Mrs. Whitfield. I was his friend, his companion, and the recipient of his kindness, but our relationship was never romantic. Eleanor studied Virginia's face, noting the careful way she chose her words and the sadness that seemed to underlie her gentle manner. But Henry supported you financially. Henry saved my life, Virginia said simply. When my husband died in 1969, I was left with crushing medical bills from his cancer treatment and an elderly mother who required constant care. I couldn't work full-time because Mother needed supervision, and the jobs I could manage didn't pay enough to cover our expenses. And Henry offered to help? Henry offered to hire me as his housekeeper and companion for his visits to Lancaster. He said he needed someone to maintain an apartment where he could stay when he had business in the area. The salary he paid was generous enough to cover Mother's care and our living expenses. Eleanor tried to understand this arrangement, which seemed more practical than romantic but still represented another secret relationship that had shaped Henry's life for decades. And you never questioned why he needed an apartment in Lancaster? Virginia smiled with an expression that was both sad and knowing. Mrs. Whitfield, when you're desperate enough, you don't ask questions that might result in losing the help you need. I understood that Henry was a married man with a complicated life. I didn't need to know the details as long as he continued to provide the stability my mother and I required. But you became friends? We became very close friends. Henry visited Lancaster twice a month for almost 30 years. We had dinner together. We talked about books and politics and our families. When she passed away 10 years ago, Henry was the one who helped me arrange her funeral and navigate the grief of losing the person who had been the center of my life for so long. Eleanor found herself thinking about all the evenings Henry had claimed to be working late or attending community meetings, wondering how many of those times he had actually been here in Lancaster, sharing quiet dinners and conversation with Virginia, while her own evenings were spent alone with television and books. He was kind to my mother, patient with her confusion and physical needs. Virginia, did you know about me? About his other families? I knew about you from the beginning, Mrs. Whitfield. Henry talked about you constantly. He showed me photographs. He shared stories about your life together. He worried about your health and happiness with the devotion of a man who was completely in love with his wife. Eleanor felt the familiar frustration rising again. But he never told me about you, or about Rose, or about Barbara. He never gave me the opportunity to know about these important relationships in his life. Virginia was quiet for several minutes, sipping her tea and gazing out the window toward Lancaster's tree-lined streets. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of careful observation. Mrs. Whitfield, I think Henry believed that you were too precious to contaminate with the complexities of his other obligations. Rose and Barbara and I were all women who had been forced by circumstances to make compromises with life's realities. We understood about imperfect solutions and partial relationships because we'd had to learn those lessons in order to survive. And Henry thought I hadn't learned those lessons. Henry thought you hadn't needed to learn those lessons. He saw you as representing the possibility of perfect love and complete happiness that he'd lost track of in his own life. Protecting your innocence became his way of preserving something pure in a world where he'd made many morally complicated choices. Eleanor stood and walked to Virginia's window, looking down at the street where people were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that upstairs an elderly woman was having her understanding of love and marriage fundamentally altered by conversations with strangers who had shared her husband's heart. Virginia, do you think Henry's arrangement was fair to any of us? To you? To Rose? To Barbara? To me? Virginia joined Eleanor at the window, and they stood side by side watching the late afternoon light slant across Lancaster's quiet downtown. Fare is a luxury that people like Rose and Barbara and I couldn't afford, Mrs. Whitfield. Henry offered us something better than fare. He offered us stability and kindness and genuine care in situations where we had very few alternatives. But what about love? What about honesty? What about the right to make informed choices about our own lives? Those are important values, Mrs. Whitfield. But so are survival and security, and having someone who cares whether you live or die. Henry's solution wasn't perfect, but it was better than the alternatives any of us faced. Eleanor turned to study Virginia's face, seeing in her expression the same complex mixture of gratitude, resignation, and affection that she'd noticed in Rose and Barbara. These women had all made peace with sharing a man who could only offer them portions of himself, and they'd built meaningful lives within those constraints. As she prepared to leave Virginia's apartment, Eleanor found herself hugging this small, gentle woman who had shared 30 years of friendship with her husband. Virginia felt fragile in Eleanor's arms, but also strong in the way that people who have learned to survive difficult circumstances often develop. "Mrs. Whitfield," Virginia said as Eleanor reached the door, "Henry loved you more than he loved any of the rest of us. Whatever mistakes he made, whatever deceptions he maintained, that love was absolutely genuine and completely devoted." Driving back to Millfield as darkness fell across central Ohio, Eleanor thought about the 3 women who had shaped her husband's secret life. Each had been different. Rose with her practical strength, Barbara with her elegant capability, Virginia with her gentle acceptance. But all had demonstrated a capacity for navigating complex emotional territory that Henry had apparently believed Eleanor lacked. Tomorrow she would have to decide what to do with this knowledge, how to integrate these discoveries into whatever remained of her own life, the community center at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church had hosted countless Whitfield family gatherings over the decades. Baptism receptions, anniversary celebrations, funeral luncheons, and holiday parties that had woven Eleanor's family into the fabric of Millfield's social life. Now, on a gray November afternoon, the same room was preparing to witness the most unusual family meeting in the town's history. Eleanor arrived early, arranging folding chairs in a circle and setting out coffee and sandwiches with the same attention to hospitality that had characterized her approach to family gatherings for 50 years. The familiar routine of preparing for guests helped calm her nerves as she anticipated the meeting that would either destroy or reshape everything she understood about family relationships. Rose Martinez was the first to arrive, accompanied by her son Tommy and daughter Sarah, whose existence had begun Eleanor's journey of discovery. Rose carried herself with the same practical dignity Eleanor remembered from their first meeting, but today her expression showed signs of nervousness about this unprecedented gathering. Barbara Johnson arrived next with her daughter Rebecca and son Michael, both of whom Eleanor had met during her visit to Centerville. Barbara's elegant composure seemed slightly strained, and Eleanor suspected that she, like Rose, was uncertain about what this meeting might accomplish or what complications it might create. Virginia Adams entered quietly, moving slowly but carrying herself with the gentle grace that had impressed Eleanor during their conversation in Lancaster. She had come alone, which somehow emphasized her role as Henry's companion rather than the mother of his children. Catherine and Daniel arrived together, their expressions carefully neutral in the way that suggested they'd spent considerable time discussing how to handle this gathering. Behind them came Thomas Bradley, carrying a briefcase that contained legal documents, and Eleanor knew additional revelations about Henry's complex planning. Eleanor looked around the circle of faces, some familiar, some still relatively new to her, all connected by their relationships with a man who had somehow managed to love multiple families simultaneously. The afternoon light streaming through the church's stained glass windows painted everyone in colors that seemed appropriate for this moment of truth and reconciliation. "Thank you all for coming," Eleanor began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I know this gathering is unusual, and I'm sure everyone has questions about why I asked you to be here together. The simple answer is that we're all family, and it's time we started acting like it." Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Mom, I'm still not sure what you hope to accomplish with this meeting. The legal issues between the families haven't been resolved, and bringing everyone together might just create more complications. Rose spoke up for the first time since arriving. Mrs. Whitfield, when you called and invited us here, you mentioned that Henry had left additional documents that might affect all our families. We're hoping you can help us understand what Henry intended for our relationships after his death. Eleanor nodded toward Thomas, who opened his briefcase and withdrew envelopes marked with each woman's name. Henry left letters for each of us, along with resources and instructions for how he hoped we might move forward as a family. Thomas distributed the letters, and the room fell silent as each woman opened her envelope and began reading Henry's final messages. Eleanor watched their faces as they processed whatever revelations or instructions Henry had left for them individually. Rose was the first to finish reading, and her expression showed a mixture of sadness and resignation. Henry apologizes for the secrecy and explains that he always intended for all the families to know about each other eventually. He says he was waiting for the right time to bring us together, but he ran out of time before he could figure out how to do it. Barbara folded her letter carefully and looked around the circle. He tells me that he loved each of us differently, but equally, and that he hoped we would be able to support each other after he was gone. He also mentions financial provisions he's made to ensure that all the children have educational opportunities and that all the women have security for their remaining years. Virginia's voice was soft when she spoke. Henry says that our friendship was one of the most important relationships of his life, and he hopes that his other families will understand the role I played in helping him navigate the emotional complexities of loving multiple people simultaneously. Eleanor realized that she was holding her breath as she listened to these revelations. Henry's letters seemed to confirm that his intentions had always included eventual transparency about his multiple families, but he'd never found the courage or the right circumstances to bring everyone together while he was alive. Tommy Martinez spoke for the first time since arriving. Mrs. Whitfield, Dad obviously spent years planning for this moment. We were raised knowing about you and respecting your place as his first and legal wife. We never thought of ourselves as competing with you for his love or attention. Rebecca Johnson nodded in agreement. Dad talked about you constantly, Mrs. Whitfield. He said you represented the best part of himself, and that everything he did was motivated by wanting to be worthy of your love and respect. Eleanor felt tears threatening as she listened to these young adults speak about Henry with obvious affection and respect, describing a version of him that was more complex but not less loving than the man she'd known. I appreciate your kindness, Eleanor replied, but I think we've all been victims of your father's inability to trust us with the truth about his feelings and obligations. He spent so much energy protecting all of us from each other that he never gave us the opportunity to create genuine relationships. Alice Cooper's voice from the doorway surprised everyone. Eleanor, I hope you don't mind that I came. I know I'm not family in the biological sense, but I've been part of this situation for so long that I felt I should be here when the truth finally comes out completely. Eleanor smiled at her oldest friend, realizing that Alice's presence felt appropriate for this gathering of everyone who had shared Henry's secret life. Alice, you're more family than most people here. Please join us. As Alice settled into the circle, Eleanor looked around at the faces of people who had all loved Henry in different ways and had all